Thanks very much, John. As John says, I have a little girl who was diagnosed with pretty severe autism when she was 3. Didn't really learn about DAN outcomes, or really weren't any at the time, until she was about age 7 or 8, and then she has improved a fair bit. Still has a long ways to go, but I'm very, very grateful, and always will be, to John and the other co-founders of DAN and everyone else for all the work they've done. And that was really what drives me in trying to do some research in this area. I've really shifted over a lot of my research. There's the website if you want more information on the work that we do. As John mentioned, I want to talk about, in particular, a research study that we're still in the process of completing, but we have quite a bit of preliminary data to show you there on vitamins, minerals, amino acids, levels in the hair. And so let's get into that. And then I'll also show you some of the sulfate data that was missing from my presentation yesterday for reasons I don't quite understand. And I'll also show you some fatty acid data from 2 previous studies. First of all, let me mention some of my collaborators. Tapan Adja, who couldn't be here today at Vitamin Diagnostics, has been a great help to me. Stephen Coburn, who measured the B6 data. I'd like to especially thank Liz Geis, if she would just stand up for a moment. Liz is the daughter of Jackie McCandless, and she was the nurse who oversaw this study. I saw the parents at the beginning and end of the study. She dealt with them week after week throughout our study and was just a godsend to me in that study, and as we hear tomorrow in our DMSA treatment study. She's just been wonderful, so I thank her very much. Julie Ingram, who did some ADOS evals for us. Sanford Newmark, who's the pediatrician for our study. Dina Goldberg, who did some nutrition analysis. PhD nutritionist. Warren Tripp, another physician who helped, and my wife Marie, who helped. She's a nurse and helped with several aspects of the study too. The study was funded by ARI mostly, and very grateful to them for that, and the Phoenix Autism Society, which I'm president of, Bayer, and some monies I got out of ASU. I want to especially thank the Vitamin Diagnostics, Doctors Data, and Great Plains Labs, because with their help, our budget was stretched much, much farther, and we were able to enroll many more kids because they were very generous. Okay, so the goals of our study have been to evaluate the nutritional status of unsupplemented children with autism spectrum disorders versus unsupplemented typical children who are age and gender matched and also socioeconomic matched, which I'll point out is very important in a moment. Also to check for correlations between the symptoms of autism and nutritional status. And so I'll show you some gory statistics in a little bit on that. As John mentioned, being an engineer, I like numbers, and so you're going to see quite a few of them as part of this. For the first study I'm going to mention, we enrolled 48 children with autism, 35 controls, aged 3 to 9, all in Arizona. None of them had used any vitamin and mineral supplements in the 2 months prior to collecting samples. Now, some of the data I'm going to show is going to be very surprising to you, and it's going to be different from some statements I've made in the past based on data from other studies. And so please be prepared for some surprises, because it surprised me. The test we've done, vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, amino acids, detailed study of vitamin B6, but we're still a little puzzled by it, toxic elements in the hair. I won't get into our organic acid oat testing. We're still analyzing that. We also did a dietary assessment of nutrient intake using a 1-week food diary, but we're going to have to wait on that. All of our samples were sent blinded to the labs. The labs did not know who the samples were coming from until at the end of the evaluation. So let's get on to the vitamins, which is some of the data I am most surprised by. What I'm showing you, I've tried to simplify it a bit, is the percentage difference in the average level of vitamins between children with autism and controls. So for vitamin A, we found that the children with autism were 3% lower, essentially no difference in the average level of vitamin A in children with autism versus typical kids. The next column is the percentage difference in the median. The median is the middle number. So if you take 50 measurements, what's the value of the 25th measurement? Right in the median. And again, we see almost no difference in the median level of vitamin A for children with autism versus controls. Then if we move over to the next two columns, the question is, what about the outliers at the low and the high end? So we defined a reference range based on our controls, with the reference range being the bottom 15% of the controls and the top 15%. So you'd expect, on average, about 15% of our kids with autism would be below the reference range, and about 15% would be above the reference range, because that's what our control distribution is like. I'll just mention, in interpreting lab data from labs, you really have to be very careful with the lab's reference range. That, as we found, even a child's range can be, for many of these vitamins, very age dependent. For our reference ranges for children ages 3 to 9, many of them agree quite well with vitamin diagnostics reference range for older kids, and some of them disagree quite a bit, because younger children can have quite different levels from older children, which again are even quite different from adults. So knowing where the reference range comes from is very important, and also knowing how they define the reference range, how broad or how narrow, is very important in understanding. Is your child just 1 standard deviation or 2 standard deviations? How different are they? So anyways, for vitamin A, we saw essentially no difference in the average levels of vitamin A. We also looked at the total carotenes, a mixture of all the different carotenes that are present in food, and a small difference in the average level, but no difference in the median. And actually, the kids with autism had a slightly narrower distribution. They were virtually all within the reference range. We looked at thiamine, and it was a little bit different in the average range and in the median range. But when we looked at the percentage below the reference range, actually 40% of the kids with autism were below the reference range. And we just had Derek Lonsdale walk into the room. He's one of our thiamine experts, and I think he'd be intrigued to see that he's been a strong advocate of the use of thiamine and thiamine derivatives like TTFD. And I think it's very interesting to see that is a concern in some kids with autism, although not all, and that's why it's not statistically significant. None of these differences reach a statistical significance of even 0.1. Pantothene, pantothenic acid, very common vitamin, again, no major differences. Vitamin B6, this is actually the P5P measured in the plasma, and we did not see any differences in this in the average, slightly lower in the median, but notice that 45% of the kids lie outside the reference range, some of them low, some of them high. Now, because of our extreme interest in plasma B6, we had this also measured we split the samples and sent another samples to Stephen Coburn's lab, and his lab also measured plasma B6 levels, and we found that those two levels had a correlation of 0.96. A correlation of 1 means there's perfect agreement between the two lab measurements. A correlation of 0.96 was very, very surprising and very, very pleasing. That's very reassuring that we can get almost the exact same two results between two different labs. And his lab, Coburn is one of the world's experts in vitamin B6. Folic acid, again, very small differences, perhaps, if anything, a touch high in children with autism, which is intriguing. B12, not much difference, but again, some outliers there. And again, with all the interest in methyl B12, then we're saying, I'm not saying that it's not useful, I'm just saying that these are the baseline levels of B12. Vitamin C, perhaps a touch low in autism, but again, not much difference. Vitamin E, not much difference. Vitamin D, not much difference. And so overall, we would say that there's really only small differences in the vitamin levels of children with autism versus controls. These differences were not statistically significant in any of them, although a few were perhaps intriguing, like the thiamine levels being a little bit lower for some of the kids with autism, but not by much. So that was a real surprise to us. I was expecting quite the opposite, because I've been saying for several years, quoting data by my good friend Tapan Aja, who did a very large study showing that children with autism tended to have much lower levels. On the other hand, Dr. Pangborn has repeatedly told me that a number of the older studies showed no difference. And so I thought I might have an interesting story to tell John. And all I can say, John, is you were right, that the vitamin levels we found were not different. So how do I explain Dr. Aja's data? So last night we had a long chat, and what we found, that we think we have an explanation for the difference in his data. The difference is that his data did involve a very large study of children with autism versus controls, but much larger than ours, but done in the same lab. But that study, his group of autistic children, 3/4 of them were from families of extremely limited income, most of them on welfare. They were also of a fairly narrow ethnic background. They were all of a Hasidic Jewish background, so they also were a fairly narrow ethnic background. And he believes, based on his interactions with them, they were generally on poor diets. In fact, some of them even needed money for food in part of their study. And so he was comparing that with controls who were recruited from his academic institution, New York University primarily, so they're primarily from upper family incomes. Our groups of kids with autism, we recruited the controls from their friends and neighbors, who were, again, similar ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds. So I think that the reason for his data, which differs from ours and from other studies, is because of the difference. His autism group was a little unusual. And so hopefully he'll go back and analyze just his other group of autistic kids. So I think that explains the difference. And so occasionally scientists have to eat their words, and I will eat my words of some of my previous presentations based on that study by their group, which I think we understand a little bit better now. And that's really what's important in science, is try to not look at just one study, but see, can we replicate it? So now let's look at the B6 data from Stephen Coburn, who measured B6 in every way that we could think of because of the extreme interest we have in it. And I have to say, just overall, we were very surprised at how little differences we found. If we looked inside the red blood cell, which is probably some of the most definitive data on PLP, which is the active form, and so we're especially concerned about PLP levels in the red blood cell where it's active for a number of different reactions, we find essentially no difference in the average level, maybe a slight difference in the median level, but not very major. PMP levels, which is also an important form, we're still measuring some of the controls to be sure, but it doesn't look like there's a very big difference there. It's not statistically significant. Plasma PLP levels, again, not much different, but notice it's a touch on the high side, if anything, versus a touch low inside the RBC. Pyridoxic acid is a little bit low in the plasma, which is intriguing. Not enough to be statistically significant, but notice in the urine, the one major difference we found in B6, very statistically significant. If it's below 0.05, we're pleased, we can publish. If it's below 0.01, we're very intrigued. If it's below 0.001, we sort of jump up and down and say, we really think we have something here. And so the pyridoxic acid levels being very low means that the B6 is not being metabolized into pyridoxic acid and coming out in the urine in high amounts. So we're very intrigued by that, but I wish I could say we understood more about it. We also looked at several relevant enzymes, pyridoxal kinase, which converts pyridoxal to the active form PLP. We were very intrigued by this data because Dr. Aja had previously reported that the Km value suggested this enzyme was very impaired in children with autism. But we find that in his activity measurements by Coburn that there was no impairment, that the levels are almost identical. Now, I'll have to explain a little bit about these measurements because there are two different types of measurements. Coburn's measurement measures what is the maximum rate at which the enzyme could work given an unlimited, very high supply of B6. Aja's data, which measures Km, is probably more biologically relevant because that's for a more typical level of B6 where he finds a difference. So what they're saying is that Aja would say that at very high levels of B6, kids with autism and control kids have a similar activity for the enzyme, but his data says that at more typical levels in the body, his low Km says that kids need a lot more B6 for this enzyme to reach that same level of activity. So they're measuring two different things there. I hope I've explained that clearly. Oxidase is a bit lower in the children with autism, not statistically significant. We're trying to understand that more. PLB hydrolase at two different pHs, not much difference. So the major thing we'd say from B6 is that there is a major difference in excretion of pyridoxic acid in the urine, but what we think would be most biologically relevant, which is the PLP levels in the RBC, we do not see a difference, and we're very, very puzzled by that. So if Adya's data were correct on his pyridoxal kinase level, meaning that children with autism need a lot more B6 to make the active form PLP, that would mean that PLP level should be much lower in the red blood cell. And that was not what we found. So we do not understand that discrepancy between these two research studies. Now also our group has done and published two previous studies which found higher total B6, but this study, which measured individual levels of pyridoxal, PLP, etc., did not find differences. We're still waiting for levels of total B6. I keep hoping we'll have that, and I think in another couple weeks we'll finally have that data, and then we'll be able to have a better chance of interpreting. So there are some differences in B6, but we don't fully understand them. I thought we would from this study because we measured everything that we could. But we're still, there's something different there, but I can't tell you for sure what all of it is. For mineral levels, we looked at magnesium in three different ways: in the whole blood, in the serum, and in the RBC, the red blood cells. And if we look at the difference in the average levels of magnesium and the median levels, there's not much difference. But there is a subset. About a third of the kids with autism are below the reference range versus only about 15% of them. So the data is a little skewed in an odd way. The serum levels, not much difference in the average or median levels, but perhaps a touch high. Whereas in the magnesium and the red blood cell, again, not much difference. So overall, we would say not much difference in magnesium, maybe a touch low in the whole blood in a few kids. In zinc, this was very surprising to me and not at all what I expected to see. And we've looked very hard and carefully at this data. Zinc in the whole blood and zinc in the RBC. We find zinc in the whole blood to be slightly higher in the average and slightly higher in the median. And we find zinc in the RBC not to be much different from children with autism. That's very intriguing because there have been some reports, particularly by Pfeiffer Lab, reporting that zinc is low in the blood of children with autism. Now, I'm concerned about those reports because I know that the Pfeiffer group uses primarily LabCorp. LabCorp's reference range is based on a mixed child and adult reference range. And that when we looked at the levels of our typical kids on that reference range, our typical kids were at the very bottom of that reference range because children have much lower levels than adults. So on a LabCorp reference range, which is a mix of children and adults, children would normally be at the lower end of that. And so you need, I hope I'm not being repetitive, but it's such an important issue that many labs do not give us proper reference ranges for pediatrics. And so it's very, very important to demand that of the labs we work with. And even a, quote, child reference range, a 3-year-old is quite different from a 10-year-old for some measurements, especially zinc. Now, again, this is just one study, and so it needs to be replicated, but I'm just trying to point out there is a scientific disagreement here. In terms of copper levels, we looked at copper in the whole blood, copper in the serum, copper in the RBC, and it's, if anything, copper is slightly lower in the serum, whereas Walsh's group has reported it to be slightly high, and copper in the RBC is perhaps slightly high in children with autism, It's not statistically significant. These are not large differences we're talking about. So realize that when we're talking about a distribution, it's one thing to say autism as a group is slightly high, but there's certainly some kids who are still quite low, some are quite high. So I'd say based on this, children with autism may not need copper for the most part. There may be a few who do, however, but there may be many who don't. So mineral levels. We looked at selenium in the whole blood, not much difference, although there may be a small subset a little bit on the high side. Manganese, a little bit low in the whole blood, and I'm going to come back to manganese. It's rather intriguing for a couple reasons. We'll talk about it in the hair data, but maybe slightly low, but not significant. Iron in the serum was a little bit on the low side, 19% low in the average. P-value of 0.06, so right at the edge of statistical significance. But serum ferritin, which is generally viewed as a more reliable measure of iron, not much different. Lithium in the serum, I'm very intrigued with lithium levels for reasons you'll hear more about. We did not see much difference of lithium in the serum, although blood levels are probably not as reliable as hair levels, and we'll come to the hair data soon. Calcium in the urine, wow, we actually found a difference in something. Calcium in the urine was about 28% lower in the children with autism for both the average and the median levels. About 30% of the kids were below the reference range, and almost none, only one child was above it. So we think that calcium is low in the urine, perhaps just because some of the children, although they were not on supplements, a few of them were on a GFCF diet. Maybe that was part of the issue. So I would just urge families, especially those on a special diet that's excluding milk, which is probably a good thing to exclude, just to be especially cautious with calcium levels. There are many supplements out there that, sure, they contain calcium, but it's 10% of what you need. So just because a supplement has calcium, you need to look at how much it has and make sure you're getting plenty. That's very important for child's growth. So a comment I want to make on all of this data, we're looking at average levels of children with autism versus typical controls. But I want to ask you, do you think the typical child in the US is eating their 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day? Okay? Probably not. So I want to emphasize the difference between a typical child's level and an optimal level. So I think the question is, do children with autism, if they have similar vitamin levels as typical children, do they still need supplements? And I think they do for 2 reasons. One is that many typical children and adults in the US have poor diets that are low in vitamin C, magnesium, iron, etc. For example, many children in our study had suboptimal iron levels. In fact, I think I skipped mentioning that. 25% of the kids in our study clearly had a very low serum ferritin level, clearly needed an iron supplement. So it's very important because low iron is a leading cause of mental retardation in the US, and many young children, many women of childbearing age are low in iron. And so just having an average level of iron, many of the typical kids in our study clearly needed iron. Also, there was a very intriguing study of typical school-age children. In their orange juice in the morning, they gave them no zinc, 10 milligrams of zinc, or 20 milligrams of zinc. Now, the RDA of zinc is about 5, so this is a relatively large dose. And they found that the typical kids getting 10 milligrams improved in their schoolwork, but the kids getting 20 milligrams improved even more. And so if typical children need that much, I would argue that although our children with autism may have typical levels of zinc, they probably are going to benefit from at least 20, if not more. Also, as Dr. Pangborn mentioned, it could be that a number of enzymes may be underactive, and a way to increase their activity is simply to give them much higher amounts of the active coenzyme, which are these vitamins and minerals. So I want to make it very clear that even if our studies found average levels of vitamins and minerals for the most part, that does not mean that those levels are optimal. And so I still remain a very strong advocate of a good nutritional supplementation, good vitamin mineral supplementation for our children. Part of the reason, as I mentioned yesterday, is we did a double-blind placebo-controlled study showing benefit. It was a small study, but still useful. Now the omega-3 fatty acid data, I'm actually going to skip most of this because unfortunately the data was reported to me as a percentage of the total fatty acids in the body. And when it's reported as a total percentage, it's very misleading. Because someone could have a average percentage of each of the fatty acids, but still have an overall low level of all of them. So I'm going to hold off on reporting this data, except to mention that we did see an unusually low level of ALA, one of the omega-3s, in children with autism. But again, this data is going to be refined in another week or so. We're just waiting for the numbers from the lab to make that revision. But again, it's supportive of the point that we need, many children with autism need omega-3s. I'll come back to that later in the talk. Okay, so moving on to essential amino acids in the urine. Now, our urine measurements were not 24-hour urines as we would have liked, because which would have been more definitive, because we're dealing with young children 3 to 9. We were lucky to get a urine in many of these kids. Getting a pediatric urine bag in a little girl when she's scooting around is difficult. Many of the kids did not appreciate that. However, so most of the urines were overnight urines. The vast majority of them were overnight urines, but not quite all. What we found in looking at amino acid levels in the urine, and I should point out that if a level is high in the urine, as Dr. Pangborn and others have mentioned, a high level in the urine for amino acids often means a low level in the plasma, means a need for it. So many of the amino acids, these are the essential ones, threonine, valine, we did not see a major difference. Methionine is very intriguing, however, and I'll pause there. Even though the difference was not statistically significant, we had a pretty good number of kids. Still, the median level was 21% lower. Now, a low level of methionine may suggest that can also suggest there's a low level in the body, and as you'll hear more from the sulfation panel this afternoon, we think that's an important finding, although we really need more children to see if it's significant or not. Lysine, however, was quite high in the urine, and we suspect that that is probably an indication of a need for lysine. Histidine was also a little bit on the high side and perhaps suggests there's a need for it. Looking at other conditionally essential amino acids, I won't go through all of them in gory detail. Your eyes are perhaps glazing over from all the numbers, so I'll just try to touch the highlights. But glycine was 31% higher on average, 17% higher in the median, and the difference was statistically significant. And cysteine levels, which we're very intrigued in for the reasons of its relations to cysteine and the whole sulfation methionine pathway, was a bit high in children with autism. And again, that's very intriguing and I think needs further study. And also I should mention, even though because a lot of this data is still being crunched, that's part of the reason it was not printed in your handout, because a lot of this data I didn't have a month ago when they called for it, but it will be available at the Dan from the ARI website in a couple weeks, so don't feel you need to frantically write everything down. When we looked at other metabolic amino acids in the urine, phosphoserine, I'm going to come back and talk about later, but notice it has just an average level here in the urine. Beta amino isobutyric, a little bit high, but just a marginal, a possible statistical significance. But for the most part, most levels like homocysteine were normal. There's been a lot of discussion about creatinine levels. Are they abnormal in children with autism? And at least in our group, for most of the kids, there was not a difference. But there seems to be a small subset where they were a bit on the low side. That's important because all of these amino acid levels are normalized versus gram creatinine. So whenever you're measuring a level in the urine, it's usually normalized against gram creatinine because it's relatively constant production in the body. So in order to know if your levels are valid, as Dr. Pangborn has educated me, it's very important to look at creatinine levels. Okay, looking at levels in the hair. This is very intriguing. We looked at toxic elements in the hair using doctor's data testing, and what we found is very intriguing. First of all, overall, you'll notice that almost all of the levels of the toxic elements are low in the hair. A few of them are statistically significant, but we have none that are higher in hair. That's very intriguing and is suggestive of an excretion problem. All right, we wish we knew more about how to interpret hair data, but that's our possible interpretation, that perhaps due to low glutathione or generally poor excretion mechanism, perhaps low levels in the hair suggest higher levels in the body. Aluminum, it was quite a significant difference, and that's consistent with our previous study that also found low levels of aluminum in the hair. Slightly low levels of nickel, clearly low levels of tin, surprisingly low levels of tin in children with autism. We didn't see that in our previous study. But I'm particularly intrigued with lead and mercury. Lead levels, 25 to 34% lower in the hair of children with autism. Mercury levels, 15 to 24% lower in children with autism. Not statistically significant, but it's intriguing. If we look at some of the essential minerals in the hair, the ones I want to concentrate on are manganese. Manganese is a bit low in hair. Which is intriguing because there have been a number of studies of, for example, prison inmates looking at behavior problems and finding that the most violent inmates are those who have high levels of manganese in their hair. Now, what's interesting is our kids have unusually low levels of manganese in their hair, because I'm going to show in a little bit, manganese seems to correlate with a number of autistic behaviors. And so it's intriguing. A little puzzling, but intriguing. Lithium is quite low in children with autism. In our previous large study of 45 children with autism, 40 controls, we also found lithium was low in the young children, not in the older children, but in the young children. Also, when we looked at mothers of children with autism, the only abnormality in the hair of mothers of children with autism was low levels of lithium in the hair. And so I think lithium is very intriguing in its importance, and I'll digress on that in just a moment. But just to finish up the hair, selenium levels perhaps a little bit low. Sulfur levels, sulfur has a very tight, narrow distribution in hair, but perhaps slightly high. Cobalt levels a bit low, iron levels a bit low. Now notice serum iron was a bit low, but serum ferritin was not. So it's intriguing. I'll come back to those in a little bit. But I want to digress for just a moment about lithium because it is consistent with our previous finding of mothers of children with autism and typical children. So this shows some of our data. The mothers of children with autism are 40% lower in lithium. The mothers of the younger children, age 3 to 8, were 56% lower in lithium. Very significant. And again, the younger children were low. Hair, we know, is a reliable measure of lithium. In fact, it's one of the most reliable measurements, and that's why, although we did not see low levels in the blood, finding it in the hair, I think, is quite significant. Lithium is probably an essential mineral, but it's not been nearly as well studied as, say, calcium or iron, not by orders of magnitude. But there have been studies of goats on lithium-deficient diets that showed they had a decreased immunological status, suffered from more chronic infections. I find that intriguing. Also, we know that low levels of lithium correlate with a wide range of psychiatric disorders, such as schizophrenia, neurosis, suicide, behavior problems, and crime, violent crimes, such as homicide, rape, and others. Also, there was a double-blind, placebo-controlled study of former drug users, and you think about our kids being opioid addicts, perhaps, that found that 400 micrograms a day of lithium, micrograms, this is a very small level, the level that is about equivalent to what you'd normally get in your food. They saw increases in happiness, friendliness, and energy, and at least the first two we want for our kids. The third one I'm not always quite so sure of. Okay, lithium is not included in most nutritional supplements, although there are a few now that do include it at a small amount. An estimated RDA is about 1,000 micrograms per day, but people in the U.S. only receive about half that amount. And one could argue that our society is a fair bit more violent than other societies around the world, and our level of intake of lithium is a fair bit lower than that of other societies. Extremely high doses of lithium, from order 250,000 to 1 million, is when it's used as a psychiatric medication for calming and mood stabilization. I am talking about levels far, far below that. At those high levels, you have to monitor liver function carefully because it can be toxic at those high levels, but at these levels I'm suggesting I don't think so. Okay, so just to summarize what I've said so far, because I know I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, I'd just like to say overall for vitamins, little difference on average, but I think for the reasons I've mentioned, they're probably needed. Typical levels are not optimal levels. Vitamin B6 data is mostly normal, except for the very low excretion of pyridoxic acid, and we're waiting on one critical total B6 measurement. I'm just going to find out if my two previous studies were right or wrong as we try to validate it. That's always the heart of science. You publish a study, you validate it, and then you should stop there. You shouldn't do that third one. Okay, minerals. Calcium is lower in children with autism. We know many children are not getting enough calcium, so I'd like to stress that as an especially important mineral. And iron levels are similar to those of typical children, but again, many of our typical children clearly need an iron supplement. Not all young children need an iron supplement. That's why iron is not included in most multivitamin mineral supplements. I don't know of a product out there in the exhibit hall that contains iron in it as part of a multivitamin supplement, because not all kids need it, and too much iron can be a problem. It's worth measuring and checking. Fatty acids, I'm going to come back to. Amino acids, we saw high excretion of lysine, glycine, and cysteine in a significant subset of the kids. Not in all kids, but quite a few of them. So I think it's very important to have a measure of amino acids, either a 24-hour urine or a plasma. I kind of like plasma because it's easier to interpret. I'm not quite as smart as John is, but if you need help, your physician can contact him. I don't think he minds me saying that. Okay, hair. Low toxics in the hair, especially aluminum, tin, and nickel. Mercury and lead were a bit lower, but not statistically significant. Now, when we did higher, and I didn't mention it, but in our previous study of mercury, we found average levels of hair in the much older kids, but in the baby hair, we found very low levels in children with autism. In these younger kids, we're finding intermediate levels of mercury, so it's consistent at least. Low lithium, I'm very concerned about, and low manganese. It was not low in the whole blood, but it was quite low in the hair, and we do know that hair is a very good marker. When it's high, that it correlates with a lot of behavior problems, aggressive behavior problems. But being low, that's odd, and perhaps we want to view it more as a toxic in the hair in that condition, perhaps. And I'll show you some data. Now we're going to get into a little bit of math, looking at correlations. Correlation means that if I'm comparing one number and another, if I get a correlation value of 1, it means each number perfectly agrees. So I take 50 kids with autism, and I look at their carotene level, and I look at their ATEC score. And can I predict, is there an exact correlation from their carotene level? Can I exactly predict their total severity of autism? And a 1 would mean I could exactly, totally predict it from that one measurement. A 0 would mean I could not predict it at all. A -1 means I can exactly inversely predict it. So with carotene, a negative correlation means that a low level of carotene, which is like a vitamin, an important nutrient, a low level of carotene correlates with a high level of severity of autism as judged by the ATEC. I think you've heard about the ATEC previously, scale put together by Bernie Rimland and Steve Adelson, and I think it's a very good marker of severity of autism. So I'm going to show you correlations with the total ATEC scale and also with the individual subscales, because I want to see, can we pinpoint, are certain nutrients or toxics relevant to certain symptoms of autism? Now, a correlation, I want to caution you, is not a causation. All right? Just because something correlates doesn't mean it causes it. It could be that because a child has autism, they don't like to eat their vegetables. So it could be because if the more severe kids don't like to eat their vegetables, they have lower carotenes. On the other hand, it could be many typical kids don't like their vegetables either. So the question is, do they dislike them more? So all I will say is that this plot down here shows a correlation, a high correlation, a 0.5 correlation is pretty strong. It's pretty amazing that any one biological measurement would correlate at close to this level. It could be just random chance. You look at enough different comparisons, it could be just random chance. But it's intriguing and worth further study. The others, low calcium correlates with more severe autism. Low GABA, which is an important neurotransmitter. It has a calming activity. Low GABA in the urine, and urine is one of the best ways to measure GABA, by the way. Low GABA in the urine correlates with more severe autism. A high phosphoserine in the urine, suggesting low levels in the body, and phosphoserine is needed for a number of reactions, correlates with more severe autism. High arsenic correlates with more severe autism. High manganese correlates with more severe autism. Now, there were some other correlations I don't fully understand, which I'm not showing yet, so I want to understand them first. If we look at speech subscales, we see more correlations. Carotenes, iron in the form of serum ferritin, low iron correlates with more severe autism. Low hematocrit correlates with more severe autism. Low hematocrit means low red blood cells. You aren't getting enough oxygen to your body. Amino acids, as a group, the amino acids had a positive correlation, meaning that a high amount of amino acids in your urine means you probably have a low amount in your body, and that correlates with more severe autism. All of that makes sense to us. And again, a correlation of manganese. In looking at social ability, carotenes, low carotenes, low niacin, low hematocrit, low serum iron, low GABA all correlate with more severe social problems. Phosphoserine and manganese, high levels of those correlate with more severe problems. Looking at sensory and cognition, carotenes, you'll see carotenes popping up again and again. Carotenes, niacin in this case, serum ferritin, hematocrit, so iron, it seems to be consistently important. GABA, consistently important. RBC, copper. High levels of copper correlate with worse sensory and cognition problems. And again, phosphoserine and arsenic are important. Looking at the health subscale, again, carotenes, low carotenes, in this case also low molybdenum, and low sulfur correlate with health issues. And high manganese, again, more health issues in autism. So again, I find those correlations intriguing. They are by no means conclusive, and please don't put too much weight on them until we've done more study. But I wanted to share them with you because these are correlations that are at least marginally, if not significant, they're at least marginally statistically significant. Then we did a more complex mathematical analysis, which Steve Edelson helped me a little bit with, but don't blame him for it, which is called a regression analysis. If one level correlates with the severity of autism, the question is, can we make a mathematical function where we try to predict the total ATEC score, the total severity of autism, as a function of individual nutrients and toxics? And so what we're trying to do is fit the total ATEC score for each individual as a function of the mercury level times the correlation coefficient, plus that times that for each one of the other nutrients. Now, we're still doing this. I've only had time to do it for the hair analysis so far. For the mathematicians in the audience, we're using a stepwise multiple linear regression analysis, doing it both forward and backward. And we start with all of our hair data, which is 36 different measurements. We then, in a stepwise manner, analyze each one of those measurements and say, is it statistically significant? If it does not have a good p-value, we remove that, redo the analysis. And we keep removing more and more measurements from our analysis until we're down to the 16 that have statistical significance. When we do that, we find that we can predict the severity of autism with a correlation factor called a multiple R with an 84% confidence, based on just the measurements in the hair. Now again, because we have so many parameters, if you have enough parameters, you can fit anything. So you have to be a little cautious. But I'll say that each one of those numbers is individually statistically significant, so it's suggestive that this sort of approach should be used in future types of biological measurements too. So I just put this up as an example of what can be done, and I find it intriguing that we can seem to correlate so much of the severity of autism with just a strand of their hair. Is it too good to be true? Perhaps somewhat, because we have so many numbers we're fitting. But it's intriguing then to look at what contributes positively and negatively. High level of arsenic or high level of manganese in the hair or high level of antimony correlates with more severe autism, whereas low levels of mercury or low levels of aluminum or low levels of lithium correlate with more severe autism. So it's intriguing and helps perhaps guide research as to what are certain elements we want to put a little bit more investigation into. But again, I want to be very cautious in interpreting this. We're still going to do other regression analysis on the other vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and fatty acids. But again, I can tell you, if just because we have so many correlations already, it's likely we'll come back with a pretty strong predictive function. The question is, can we then take a new set of data, and how well will that predictive function work? Will it completely flop, or will it actually be a useful measure? One of the reasons I'm really intrigued about this type of analysis is we can then look at an individual symptom, like say seizures, and say, do seizures correlate with certain nutrients? Or do certain health problems correlate with certain nutrients or toxics? And again, a correlation is not causation, but it may help guide us so we can get more mileage out of our data. Okay, so to conclude our statistical analysis, many of our measurements correlate with the severity of autism, and a lot of it we can understand, but not all of it. But we do need to replicate it with a larger study. This sort of regression analysis, I think, is very intriguing to allow prediction of total severity of autism or individual symptoms, and it may be a useful guide for future investigations. Now, I wanted to show you some of the sulfate data. Oh, good, it came up this time, that for some reason didn't show yesterday. So this is from my colleague Tapan Aja, not from our study, looking at 96 children with autism. And what he found is he tried a wide range of different ways to normalize sulfate levels. Again, children with autism tend to excrete high amounts of sulfate in the urine and tend to have low levels of plasma sulfate. It seems to be very important. And what he found is that a magnesium sulfate bath, an Epsom salt bath, led to a good increase in the sulfate level. So they started out at a level of 182, and that Epsom salt bath, within 2 hours after an Epsom salt bath, their level went from 182 to 831. It's a pretty big jump. I like those little Epsom salts. I was a little skeptical when Susan Owens first brought it up, but boy, I'm pretty fascinated by it. But what worked out even better was MSM, at a relatively reasonable dose, went up to 1,500. But again, in looking at these other levels, someone asked me, well, what about some of these creams or using a gel patch? Those would work too, but you need to use a large amount. Sulfur is the third most common mineral in your body. You need very high amounts of it, probably of order 0.5 gram to 1 gram a day to have a significant effect. So Epsom salt baths, and MSM seem to be especially effective, but taurine and NAC also help to some degree. And if you use larger amounts of them, they would help normalize too. Okay, then I want to turn to essential fatty acids. Just to briefly, John, how much more time do I have? Not much. Okay, I'm going to turn to it very briefly then, and just say that omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids are very important to human life, critical to human life, but because omega-3 fatty acids spoil rapidly, that they are removed from most foods by commercial food manufacturers so that those Twinkies can sit on the shelf for 6 months before you can eat them, because no self-respecting bug would eat them. You can hydrogenation, partial hydrogenation, many methods to destroy them. But you need them. So today, American diets have about a 1-to-15 ratio of omega-3 to omega-6, and it used to be about 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. Any college nutritionist, any campus would agree with that statement. All right? Most people in the U.S. do not get enough omega-3s. One of the best sources of them is fish. There were 2 studies that found low essential fatty acids in autism. A great source of them is fish. but you want fish that's low in mercury, please. Things like salmon, sardines, little fish. I'm going to jump a little bit. We did a large double-blind placebo-controlled study but it was only for 8 weeks because we're a little impatient. And what we found using supplements and Nordic Naturals is that we found very little improvement in the autism group, in the treatment group compared to the placebo group. We did find that the Pro-DHA worked better than the Pro-Omega, and that was statistically significant. The Pro-Omega actually did slightly worse than the placebo group. So I definitely like Pro-DHA more. But what was intriguing is that the sociability subscale did improve a bit, and that was statistically significant in just 8 weeks on just taking these little fish oil pills to see a nice improvement in social ability. The ATEC scale reduced, but it was only an 8-week study. Tapan Adja is a much more patient man than I am, so he did a 9-month, actually it was 11-month study of children with autism. It was an open study involving 67 kids with autism. He gave them 2 grams a day of omega-3s and a half gram a day of omega-6s, evening primrose oil. And I think that's a smart thing to do. I didn't know as much now as I did then. Sorry, other way around. I did not know as much then as I do now. Hopefully I'm not getting worse. And his study lasted for 9 to 11 months. And he likes this ratio of 4 to 1 parts of omega-3s to omega-6s. Anyways, what he found, and this is the data I showed yesterday, but just thought I'd explain it a little bit more, is the EPA levels and DHA levels, which are 2 of the critical omega-3s, were low compared to the controls. The controls had a level of 1. These kids had only about 65% of that. After supplementing them for 9 months, they found levels well above normal, which is a good thing because a normal level is far from an optimal level. And then also arachidonic acid, which at high levels is a concern. At high levels, it was high in children with autism. At high levels, it can cause inflammation. He found that after supplementation, it decreased. Arachidonic acid is an omega-6, but it competes. The formation for it competes with formation of DHA. So if you take more fish oil, it will indirectly reduce the arachidonic acid levels. I think I'm going to scare you some of the gory details. Part of the reason for the arachidonic acid abnormality seems to be a higher activity of phospholipase A2. It's about a factor of 2 higher in kids with autism, and that's part of the reason it appears why they have this problem. I seem to be missing, again, some of my view graphs there. Okay. In terms of long-term effect of omega-3 fatty acids, all we can say is we know from many, many studies from heart patients it's very, very good for your heart. In this study, it led to improvements in blood pressure, improved heart rate, improved levels of prostacyclin, meaning improved vasodilation and other issues as well. So you want improved vasodilation so you have better blood flow, improved HDL, which is your good cholesterol. So a number of advantages there. Missing, I don't know why it's not showing up. All right, well, just to conclude then, I'd like to close with a quote that I think from the book by Dr. McCandless. I would say children with autism are children with starving brains and starving bodies. That I think, although they may have typical levels of vitamins and minerals for the most part, a few were a little low, still many typical children need them. So I think virtually every typical child is going to need them unless they're eating a terrifically good diet of 5 fruits and vegetables a day. Many kids with autism clearly have abnormal amino acids compared to typical kids. And so whereas most typical kids may be fine with their protein consumption, it seems kids with autism have a wasting of protein in the urine, or at least have a higher level of amino acids in their urine. And so may well benefit from either a digestive enzyme to help them digest the amino acid protein better. Protein is a very large chain. You need digestive enzymes to break it up into individual amino acids, which is the only thing your body can use functionally. Also, many kids need essential fatty acids. We have now 2 studies. One of the things I forgot to mention about Dr. Adja's study, the most important thing is the outcome. 80% of his kids in his fatty acid study, after 9 months, found dramatically good improvement in their GI function. They did pre and post endoscopies in half of the children, and they found the inflammation was almost completely gone after 9 months of using fish oil. So we've heard a lot about gut problems, and my feeling is that I think many of the reasons for these underlying gut problems and food allergies and immune issues is perhaps simply due to the fact that our kids happen to be having low levels of omega-3 fatty acids. Now remember, moms, where do they get most of their omega-3 fatty acids from? From their mother during birth and during nursing. So if the kids are low, guess who else is probably low, or at least was at that time? And it is well known that low levels of fatty acids are the leading cause of postpartum depression. Women sacrifice their fatty acids to give them to their newborn children because they're so critical for brain development. But in the process of doing that, they give up their own nutrients. So also, I'm not just a fan of supplements. I'm a very strong believer in getting those vegetables and fruits in the kids and good sources of protein as well. But supplements are also needed in most cases and have a proven benefit. So with that, thank you very much for your patience.